we've seen here in Australia a lot some issues with privacy breaches. Okay, to name a few, and there's been several. Medibank is one of the largest, almost 10 million people affected here in Australia, relatively recently in the last year. Optus was another big one, big telco here in Australia, around 2 million people affected. And even MyDeal, which is a subsidiary of Woolworths, over 2 million people affected in that instance as well. And so clearly there is an issue with people's private information not being stored in a way that is really that safe. So we've seen this a fair bit in the news, and it seems to be on the minds of both the common person, because it's obviously our information. And so we have an interest in, I guess, securing that. But we also need to function in society. And to do that, we're having to put passwords in, we're having to put dates of birth in, we're having to do this stuff constantly and every day, almost regularly. We're seeing sort of the government response to that has always been a legislation response, and I'm not going to harp on this because this is not supposed to be coming like a law podcast, but I will just mention that the current solution is really to continue legislating in this area. So currently there's the Privacy Act, which is a Commonwealth Act, so it governs the whole of Australia, which makes sense because this stuff crosses boundaries. It's not just state-based. And so basically this bit of legislation, it was in 1988 that it was enacted, and it just kind of governs and guides the way businesses interact and hold our data and our information. Interesting point just to be made is that small businesses with turnover less than 3 mil actually are exempted from this particular legislation. And it's actually outworked practically through a series of 13 what's called Australian privacy principles. And this is provided for in section 15 of the legislation. So then you look to the principles. I'm not going to go through 13 of them. I'll just give you a sense of them with maybe 3. So basically one of them, for example, is permitting solicited collection of personal information only where reasonably necessary for the legitimate function of a business. Broadly speaking, that makes a lot of sense, but how do you define that? And to be honest, that hasn't really been at issue here. It's more so been like people hacking in and getting the information. It's not necessarily the fact that it's being given out wrongfully in most of these situations. Number 6, for example, is that information must only be used for a purpose for which it was collected. So it's good to know that when you're putting your information in there, the reason that it sort of gives you for needing to collect that, whether it's to create an account or whatever it is, it's collected on the provision that it's used only for that purpose, not to then, and as outlined in the next one, which is number 7, there's a general prohibition against like using that information then to directly market towards those people. And I personally think every now and then you do see like dodgy little companies who do that, where and there has to, if there is any direct marketing that does skirt around this, there has to be an opt-out function. So you see that in emails and stuff like that. And so if you're getting emails and there's no unsubscribe, or you're unsubscribing and it's not working, technically they're in breach of with this act, which is interesting. So I think there might be a better Web3 solution to solve
that's
this
what
issue.
we needed.
And so I think, and I feel like maybe we may have mentioned this concept here and there, skirted around it, but I think we need to dive into it head on for a moment here, which is the concept of soulbound tokens. Do you feel as though we've mentioned it at all? Do you remember it coming up at all?
No, I'm not sure. So You're saying that there's a solution to collecting privacy information, or like there's a solution where they can't be hacked, that database can't be hacked?
Yeah, so we'll go through it, but basically the summary is this solution would no longer require you to put unique and specific information into every database, but instead encapsulate it in one decentralized place and use that token to then verify all of these different derivative platforms that you want to go and use. And so therefore those platforms, they don't have access or purview to that actual information. They simply see the tick that's generally accepted as being verified by XYZ. And we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that. But that's kind of the summary. Does that sort of make sense?
That makes sense. So that's sort of similar to the way that Firebase collects passwords. So Firebase is a commonly used databasing system which people use to generate web apps and iOS apps and all that kind of thing. And what they can do is they can actually store the password without the startup actually seeing what the password is.
Gotcha.
So that's a really interesting thing. But then that's relying on
But Firebase
Google's
themselves
security.
have it, right? So
Yeah, so
Firebase
Firebase is a Google product,
is
so
the
it's
weak
relying
point.
on Google's security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing I wanted to do, and just very briefly, is I just wanted to maybe not assume that everybody fully understood what an NFT is, because there may be some, we haven't necessarily talked about it on the podcast for a little while. And so I just wanted to give a very brief summary of what an NFT is, so that then when we move into a soulbound token, which is a derivative of that, you're not so totally lost in the woods.
What's an NFT, Nathan?
Thank you for asking. So basically, and we'll try and go through this very briefly, but it's an asset that exists and is being turned into like a token that sits on a blockchain network. So let's just break some of those bits down. So basically, the blockchain, for example, consists of continuous and open transactions, in that the transactions can be verified by any participant in the network. And they're blocked into little baskets of transactions to make it more efficient. So it's not just a constant stream of transactions, it's a constant stream of blocks. And those, as I said, they can be verified using, like, for example, to make this practical, tools like ETH Explorer, for example. You could go on and you can literally see transactions, you can see which wallet it's come from and where it's going. And so there's an element of openness while still anonymity, which I think is to a certain extent the key that we're going to sort of get to here in the end, which is verification while still being anonymous, meaning that the actual underlying data is not available. Some conversation about the tokens then that are on this network is basically they're distinguished by unique attributes that have been assigned to them. So there's fungible tokens, which is cryptocurrencies, and which basically means that if Isaac has one Bitcoin and I have one Bitcoin, and we both transfer it to each other, it makes no difference. We both still have one Bitcoin. It doesn't matter which Bitcoin it is, if that makes any kind of sense. Whereas non-fungible tokens means they're not interchangeable, is sort of the good word to throw in there, which means that if Isaac and I had two different NFTs and we swapped, we would actually have different NFTs. And, depending on what attributes they had, one or the other may be more valuable, even if the picture or, the face value of them looked quite similar. And so the fungible tokens are ERC20 standard. And the standards are really just kind of like, it's kind of like a pro forma, so that when different tokens and different projects are interacting, they all express the attributes of their tokens in the same way. So the first variable is defined as the same variable across different tokens, if that kind of makes sense. So when transactions are happening, you can see the attributes all lining up together as to what this is and what that is and stuff like that. So it's like a pro forma instead of writing a unique contract every time you were trying to transact with someone. ERC 721 is the standard NFT token, which we have seen. It's starting to be surpassed by ERC 1155, which is to a certain extent a hybrid standard, which allows you to, have transactions which are both fungible and non-fungible, and it allows you to bundle a number of assets into a single transaction, which is quite helpful when you may have like a large number of tokens all at once that need to be moved around, and you don't have to do them. And then you're talking about gas fees, which is what you're trying to get around in that situation if you were doing individual transactions, which can be quite expensive. There's a couple of other ones that we've never ever talked about that I was looking at. I don't know how new they are. Maybe is this ERC 777 or ERC 777?
I've seen that one.
And from what I can tell, it's very similar to the standard form 721.
I'm feeling like that's a newer one. I don't know.
I think so too, but it seems to add a couple of functions or a couple of features, like a couple of new variables, and one of them seems to be an ability to recover the private key in some manner. So I don't know if that makes it, I don't know, slightly less decentralized. I'm not sure.
It's so funny because that's like it was like initially the point to not be able to recover the private key, because that's like some secret key that you're supposed to have, that's your key to getting into it. So you're supposed to be smart enough to not lose that, right?
That's right.
And then so many millions of people have gone and lost their private keys
Yes.
that they've brought like a recoverable
That's right.
option out.
That's right.
And it's almost like, no, you're missing the point, you know?
That's right. But they're also, it's like also a branding issue for Web3, where it's like all these people now hate it because of their own issues with losing their key. So yeah, you're right. I don't know in practice if people are using this token, but it certainly does exist. And then the only other one which I've certainly never ever heard of is ERC 4626. Which is an interesting one. And I'll just touch on it here. It's a little technical, but basically it's the standard when you're transacting with a yield-bearing vault. So what does that mean? So basically, let's take an example. So DAI, we're aware of DAI as a token. So you could deposit DAI into a yield-bearing platform. We'll talk about what that is in a second. And to represent your stake in that pool that you've just placed your token into, you get VDAI, for example. And that's literally a new token that tracks your stake as people take, and put tokens into it. And it also tracks the interest that's being earned on it. So the yield-bearing vault, for example, what actually happens in that is it's kind of like a pool of assets that then, based on code that's been sent, kind of parameters that have been set by the person who's created the pool, it's maybe their own unique model, is it gets deployed. The assets get deployed around a whole different bunch of different earning derivative platforms behind that. And so it allows you to just kind of set and forget, if that makes sense. You can put it in there, someone's written a model, and it gets deployed as it sees fit. And you get that V token, which represents your stake in it. So that's just a different type of token as well. So just out of interest, if anyone finds that interesting. The only other point is that tokens are initially minted. Minted is obviously the word that's used when it first comes into existence. And that's not new to us. We have a mint for fiat currency from the government. And so that's something that's carried across over into Web3, which is cool. And obviously they can then be exchanged or traded on exchanges or platforms such as OpenSea or Rarible. And then you can hold them either in a cold wallet, which is a little bit complex for someone who's not super Web3 literate. Even myself, I find it a little bit too much of a headache. And I really don't have enough assets to care that much. And so I would prefer just to hold it and play around with it on something like MetaMask, which is, like an extension you can have on your Chrome, for example, that allows you to access different sites and stuff like that. So that's a little bit of an overview of the NFT space. Hopefully people found that interesting and the stuff you can dive into.
That reminds me a lot of charged particles with mango dogwood.
Which is a throwback to a previous project, which was Another Block Studios that we did in combination with Another Block. And that's right. Yeah, that's right. They had nested NFTs where you could earn interest while it was nested inside another NFT. Kind of like do you call them babushka dolls? Is that what they call?
Yeah.
That's kind of the analogy.
Babushka?
Babushka?
I don't know.
Babushka. I'm confident in that. Babushka doll. NFTs for babushka dolls.
Babushka.
So yeah, that's a good point. So basically now what we have is the issue of privacy. We're aware of that. We're aware of the context and the issues we've seen here in Australia. We're aware of maybe what an NFT is to a basic extent. And so let's take the NFT concept a step further to what soulbound tokens are. So soulbound tokens were introduced as a concept by Vitalik about a year ago, actually. I think it was in May 2022. So it's still relatively new, and not a lot, to be honest, has sort of happened in the Web3 space in that period. Had he have introduced this a year before that, or maybe a little before, people would have picked it up really quick, and it probably would have escalated quite fast. But we're seeing more limited development in this area now, and so things are moving more slowly.
The old crypto winter.
Well, that's right, exactly right. And so, from my moderate research, there's pretty limited practical application of this because there's a number of big issues or big challenges to overcome. It's more so a conceptual idea, but it's pretty good. And so let's dive into it. So basically, if you want to read the white paper, it's called Decentralized Society, Finding Web3's Soul. That was the paper. It's about 40 pages long. And I said May 2022 it came out. So it lays the foundation for what they term DSOC, which is Decentralized Society. Or maybe you would pronounce it DSOS, but it doesn't really look like DSOS. And so essentially, the overview is that the what we're calling an SBT, which is a soulbound token. Okay, I'm going to refer to it as an SBT. Is like a digital identifier that represents traits, features, and even like achievements. And we'll dive into some potential practical uses for this. And they are distributed by souls. Okay, and the soul represents a particular wallet. And once it's been transferred to another soul, it is no longer able to be transferred. So this is unique in that. And one good take on it that I read was, let's talk about, for example, a DAO at the moment, right? Again, haven't seen a lot of action in this space recently, but we have in the past seen DAOs formed to do interesting things. And arguably, one of the issues that could be at stake with a DAO is that anyone who's quote unquote rich can just go in, buy up majority stake in it, and then make decisions. And that's contingent on being able to buy them and things like that. But technically speaking, it's possible. Whereas in this situation, if instead organizations were governed by SBTs, sorry, that would mean that once you're handed an SBT for your involvement in the program, you can't on-sell that, which means that the people who hold them, or the number that are held by each person, are a direct reflection of their engagement with the project, as opposed to their financial ability to just purchase them, if that makes sense. And so that's a little interesting, unique take on how it could help governance, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that is a cool way to look at it, because typically you look at a company structure and the person that can come in and buy the largest portion of the company gets to run it, whereas sometimes they're not the biggest contributor. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's interesting. In regards to a few use cases, then we'll talk about another issue that it solves, which is the key, which we've talked about previously. Because let me bring that up in a minute. But basically, ideal world, right, is that the government gets on board with this idea and hands out a one of one. The key is it has to be a one of one, like identifier, SBT identifier, to every person that identifies them as being that person, and having a number of attributes, as I mentioned. And then you can use that to then simply just verify that you're a real person on a whole bunch of different platforms. A few other interesting takes on it before we dive into the recovery issue, because obviously, if we're saying that the key to this functioning is the rarity or the scarcity of those SBTs, be it that there's only one available. Because if they could continuously be handed out, then people can hack the system and just keep saying, oh, I've lost it, I've lost it. You just keep getting new ones. Then you've got multiple identities of the same person. That's a big issue. So the key here is only allowing one SBT per authorization or verification or whatever you're doing. But the issue with that is then if it's lost, that's your identity effectively lost forever.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
And so we'll talk about that in a minute. A few other interesting use cases is centralized exchange verification. So Binance, for example, centralized crypto exchange, they do have a token called BAB token, and it's used to verify that the particular holder has already undergone their KYC, know your customer, Binance process. And so instead of having to then do another KYC on some derivative alternative platform, Binance can provide that verification, and you're not then having to provide those details to another person. Scan your, I don't know whether it's like your ID and things like that, which are actually quite sensitive. Another one which is quite obvious, I think, when you first start thinking about this, is career and education. So, for example, education providers, so universities could be souls in that they're able to hand out SBTs, and you could get handed an SBT which represents, an undergrad degree, or I don't know, like a graduate certificate or something like that, and then you can basically use these to verify education when you're doing job applications. Another interesting one is LinkedIn. And I always thought this was a bit of a flaw to the system, where technically there's, I know I've looked it up a fair bit because I run a small organization, like a small society here at the university that I'm at. And there's a few people who have still on their profile their previous positions in our association. And I wanted to see if there's anything that the association can do to enforce their removal of that position, if that makes sense, because they're no longer in that position. They're off. And
Yeah.
it's actually, from what I can tell, it's actually not possible, other than like literally emailing people at LinkedIn to try and ask them to do it. There's no function that allows you to do that, which I think is an issue. Because then what that means is basically people can put a whole bunch of untrue things on their LinkedIn about previous experience.
Yeah.
And the onus
Harvard
is
Business School.
Harvard Business School, whatever.
Yeah.
And what are we doing? Like, what an employer going to call up Harvard, trying to get them to go through all of their previous like 500,000 students and try and find if this student was ever a student there? Like, unlikely they're going to do that. And so I think I don't know if people are actually doing this, but it seems to be a potential issue if people aren't already doing it. So this obviously solves that, in that you can only, like, you've got to use an SBT which has come from that Sol, be it Harvard, for example, and that actually verifies that you actually got it from there. So it's a cool solution to that, to the LinkedIn problem. Other ones is like health, obviously, like vaccinations, pretty relevant thing we've seen recently. How do you prove that? You just use an SBT, makes a lot of sense. I talked about social governments. And another interesting point here is unsocial digital behavior. So we've seen both in the metaverse, there's, videos of people going in and, I don't know, smashing people's, I don't know, like going into fake shopping centers and just smashing all the shopping trolleys everywhere. And like, which is like fun. I get it. But like, if we're as a society, no. If as a society we're supposed to be taking this a little more seriously, then that's going to be an issue. We're even on, on blogs and on chat forums, there's people who are the anonymity allows them to just go and say whatever they want, things that are really not appropriate and you wouldn't say in everyday life. So SBT, again, could come into play here. You need to verify your identity in some way using an SBT to get onto these platforms, for example. Again, this is all decentralized. And then you can get in, and then there could be a voting system whereby people can get, certain SBT holders could get voted off the platform, and that SBT or a wallet that holds that SBT could never use that platform ever again and be banned. So basically, you could ban people without even knowing who they are. And so I think that's a really interesting use case, remembering that they can't be transferred. So you'd have to set up a whole nother wallet, which is possible, but it's certainly a barrier to people going about this behavior. So I think that's an interesting use case. I think probably one of the final things to discuss is the looming issue of wallet recovery here. So if you're then creating a wallet which is you, it's your identity, what happens if you lose this key that we've been discussing? And we've seen it happen with large chunks of crypto and stuff like that. And it's there's some pretty devastating and somewhat humorous stories out there of people. I think there's a guy who like bought a garbage dump or something to try and find his $20 million worth of Bitcoin or something, like just things like that. And so there's two solutions that Vitalik have outlined in this white paper. The first one is noted as a not great solution, but still noted, is social recovery, which is obviously, just in case anyone really didn't pick that up, the current method of recovering or accessing your decentralized wallet, that is a wallet that's not actually held by another company like a Binance or something who's helping you use it, is a seed phrase. Seed phrase is usually how many? Do you remember how many words it generally is? It's a lot of words.
24.
Yeah, I thought it was in the 20s. So circa 24 words, which is a lot of words. That's not a sentence. They're just random words, and the onus is on you to then save that somewhere. And so that's the current solution, decentralized solution. The first method is called social recovery. So instead, the user or the wallet holder can curate a list of what's called guardians, who give them power to effectively change the wallet key if they're all in unanimous agreement to do so. Now, the issue here is obviously good security would require a high number of guardians. If it was just one person, then it's arguably it's a very simple solution, but it's not a very secure solution. So arguably, it needs to be a high volume of guardians and also quite a diverse range of guardians, ideally, not a whole bunch of guardians who are all in your World of Warcraft team or something, of which you all offend on one particular occasion and all decide to change your key, for example. So
right, yeah.
it needs to be a diverse group of people and a large number of people. And the issue is obviously that guardians can pass away. So imagine if it's unanimous, it needs to be unanimous, and someone dies. And so then you then have to go and find the key or change the key for their account. And then you're going down a rabbit warren here. Obviously, relationships sour, as I inferred there previously. And so that's going to be an issue as well. If some person refuses or won't communicate with you anymore, again, it's effectively lost. So there's some issues. Obviously, and then, because of that, it may require regular maintenance of that list, updating it, changing it, depending on your relationships. Not a bad idea, but maybe not foolproof. The better idea that Vitalik suggests is what's called community recovery, which is not a curated list that you control, but instead it draws upon some of the most significant and real-time community relationships that are relevant to your SBT holdings in your wallet, if that makes sense. So you get an SBT from Harvard or something. Maybe Harvard's not a great example, but an SBT from your local university or from some other organization or from a community group you're a part of, etc. These are all souls that can then make up your community of recovery guardians, of which you're not defining, but are just defined by what you hold in your soul. And then basically the owner of the soul can request, and consent must be provided by all of these holders. Now, the key to, and what it assumes in this situation, is that what they call off-chain communications can occur to authenticate the owner's request. So basically what that means is if Isaac is one of the sole holders of an SBT that has been transferred to me, I will request, he'll see the request on whatever this system actually looks like one day, and it requires me to verify in some way that he feels satisfied that I am the person who owns it, and I am actually requesting that we change the key. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Obviously, it makes no sense if you can't do that. If I can't access you outside of that request, then it's just a random request from some random wallet. And so I need to create some sort of verification off chain for that to really work well. So yeah, it's interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's cool. I think that there's a lot of thought that goes behind verifications and kind of identity management in blockchain. And I think some problems don't need as much solving as you think. So I think like some solutions are kind of over engineered regarding community verification and things like that. I think there's already a lot of these things sort of in the real world, power of attorney to act over a will. This person is, it's like a principal agent problem as well. Like this person's acting on behalf of me, and so I think that there are a lot of real world solutions, and I think it probably could become a more of an issue in the future because as we're seeing more sort of AI stuff come up, people could very quickly duplicate identity details and try and sort of you can also generate voice and everything like that now. So I think a lot more people could kind of call using your voice based on like recordings on the phone or whatever, regenerate your voice, talk to the bank, and then kind of recover your
Yeah.
passwords from there. So I think there's
Yeah.
definitely a lot of value in sort of privacy and security stuff.
The security is only as secure as the weakest link, and your point there is good, which is if the weakest link is that you still have to call the person to verify yourself, and that can be done now through AI, through voice cloning, then yeah, you're right. Is it really that
Yeah,
secure?
exactly. Yeah. So I think the idea of I liked the most probably the idea of a jury of people that maybe. And then maybe you make the decision 66% as opposed to unanimous. Then a few people die or change between last year when you looked at it. Yeah, maybe that's the best solution. I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah, special resolution, 75%.
yeah,
I think that's probably a good solution as well, I think. The only other thing to be said, and this is just the last point, is revocation. So there is some discussion in the paper, and again, this is all I think relatively theoretical, but there is some discussion around um, the owner of the soul who originally distributed the SBT having a function that allows them to revoke the transfer of that SBT to the second to the owner. to the recipient is the better word. And that sort of could change a few different things in regards to, for example, people's ownership in like the DAO situation that we talked about. If someone, if people fall out, or maybe that's a bad example, but if someone starts to become unaligned, or a group of people are unaligned with the majority, then there could be a function that revokes their stake in that particular DAO. There's potentially some ethical, moral issues with being able to do that. Generally speaking, the majority rules, or the 75% on special resolution stuff that we see in day-to-day world in membership in a company, seems to be a relatively fair solution. Revoking people's rights due to misalignment could be an issue. I think it could lead to some bigger issues, but it seems to be a function that is being discussed as well.
Yeah, that's cool.
So yeah, that's it. So the summary and where the context for this maybe is that I've been on a sort of a little mini training course for 3 weeks, one night a week with a law firm here in where am I? Melbourne. And they're a big firm here in Australia, and they have been discussing a few different topics: AI, metaverse, NFTs, from a legal context. And there's been some conversation around Soulbound Tokens. Not a lot of their stuff. One of their key staff members, who is responsible for the region for tech, brought it up as being a really interesting solution. And I do agree that it's probably something it's a little known thing that's not talked about as much, because it inherently sits outside of the hype train, because it's not something you can speculate on, because it's not possible to flip it. And so it gets no airtime. But it maybe one day is one of the things that comes out of NFTs that is actually of utility to society.
Yeah, interesting.
Are you struggling to get your name out there? Do you want to attract more customers? Maybe just increase your revenue? Well, look no further than Unique. They're an all-in-one marketing agency, and they'll help take your business to the next level. They believe in marketing that should be both effective and enjoyable, and I tend to agree. So they offer a range of services such as web design, branding, social media management, and lead generation. The team of experts, they'll work with you to develop a tailored marketing strategy that fits the unique needs of your business. And they don't just stop at making you look good, but they're specialized in setting up lead generating machines. Their top secret methods will help you capture and convert your leads, leading to increased sales and revenue for your unique business. So search NEW NIQ UE on Google to learn more and schedule a free marketing consultation via their website. So let Unique take your business to the next level.
Index is a tech-focused recruitment platform passionate about scaling your engineering team, maintaining 95% placement success. To date, they've vetted over 8,000 developers, boasting on average more than 7 years experience across their recruits. Index supplies talent to industry-leading clients such as Omeo, a German unicorn that's raised almost $500 million USD, Perforce, a US-based leading DevOps solutions provider with over $300 million USD in annual revenue, and many others, some of which are backed by firms such as Goldman Sachs and Y Combinator. So if you're struggling to find the right talent, concerned about high employee costs and staff turnover, Index has the solution for you. Through comprehensive assessments, in-depth interviews, and a robust vetting process, Index can provide your business with the very best international tech talent in less than 7 business days. For contracts greater than 6 months, Index is offering a 10% discount to HQLA fans the next time you hire using their platform.